Fact 1. In the ancient, sun-baked markets of Babylon, nearly 4,000 years ago, the earliest seeds of risk management were pressed slowly into wet clay. The merchants of that distant era, whose caravans traversed the dusty, windswept trade routes, operated under a code etched into black basalt steles by King Hammurabi. This practice, known as bottomry, was not a written contract on parchment, but a tangible understanding that if a merchant received a loan to fund a shipment, and that shipment was lost to the thieves of the desert or the storms of the sea, the loan would not need to be repaid. One can imagine the merchant sitting in the shade of a mud brick wall, feeling the rough texture of the clay tablet under his fingertips, tracing the cuneiform wedges that promised safety, listening to the steady, rhythmic breathing of the camels resting nearby, secure in the knowledge that the financial burden would vanish like smoke if the journey failed. Fact 2. Drifting from the arid deserts to the rhythmic lapping of the Mediterranean Sea, we find the merchants of Rhodes developing the general average, a principle as constant as the tides. The concept was simple yet profound. If a ship was caught in a heavy, rolling storm, and the captain was forced to jettison cargo to lighten the vessel, the loss would be shared proportionally by all who had goods aboard. Visualize the scene on the wooden deck, the gray sky merging with the gray water, the heavy crates of olive oil and wine being lifted with great groaning effort and dropped into the frothing waves. It was a mathematical smoothing of misfortune, a way to ensure that no single individual would bear the crushing weight of a total loss, creating a communal safety net woven from the very fibers of shared risk and maritime necessity. Fact 3. As the centuries waned and the Roman Empire rose with its marble columns and paved roads, the concept of insurance found a quiet home in the collegia or burial clubs. These were not commercial enterprises, but solemn associations of the common people, gathered in dim, torchlit rooms to pay small monthly stipends into a communal chest. They sought only the peace of a proper funeral, the assurance that when their final breath was drawn, there would be funds for the pyre and the rites. Picture the coins, cool and smooth copper, clinking softly into the wooden box, a steady, monthly rhythm that echoed the passing of time itself, providing a comforting structure to the inevitability of death, ensuring that even the poorest citizen could rest in the earth with dignity and silence. Fact 4. Following the slow decline of Rome, the structure of protection migrated to the medieval guilds, where the air was thick with the smell of sawdust, tanned leather, and molten iron. In these stone halls, craftsmen pledged their loyalty to one another, creating a web of mutual aid that covered losses from fire, robbery, or the gradual failing of health. It was a world of heavy oak tables and parchment ledgers, where the scratching of the quill recorded the contributions of weavers and blacksmiths alike. If a workshop burned down in the night, the guild would rebuild it stone by stone, plank by plank, a slow, methodical restoration of order that allowed the artisan to return to his bench, pick up his tools, and resume the quiet, repetitive work of his trade without the paralyzing fear of destitution. Fact 5. The narrative of risk takes a more formal turn in the bustling, salt-sprayed port of Genoa in the 14th century, where the first distinct insurance contracts were separated from loans and investment. Here, in the cool, shadowed counting houses, scriveners drafted policies that specifically covered the perils of the sea, unrelated to the financing of the ship itself. Imagine the scrivener's hand, steady and deliberate, dipping the quill into the inkwell, the liquid black creating loops and lines that quantified the unpredictability of the ocean. He would write of perils of the seas, winds and storms, transforming the terrifying chaos of a tempest into a calculated premium, a static number on a page that could be filed away in a quiet cabinet, insulating the merchant from the raw, elemental power of nature. Fact 6. We drift further north through the mists of time to the narrow, timber-framed streets of London, where the Great Fire of 1666 would fundamentally alter the landscape of stone and safety. Before the smoke had even fully cleared from the charred ruins, a new kind of thought emerged, one that sought to indemnify the very structures of the city against the hunger of flames. It was in this post-fire atmosphere, heavy with the scent of wet ash and rebuilding, that Nicholas Barbin established the first fire insurance office. One can visualize the bricklayers slowly raising new walls, the mortar damp and gray, while inside the office, clerks methodically recorded the dimensions of houses, issuing metal fire marks to be affixed to the facades, heavy iron badges that stood as silent sentinels, promising that if the fire returned, the financial foundation would remain unshakable. Fact 7. The evolution of this industry found its most iconic home not in a bank, but in the warm, coffee-scented air of Edward Lloyd's Coffee House on Tower Street. It was a place of low murmurs and rustling broadsheets, where ship owners and wealthy individuals gathered to share news of shipping schedules and weather patterns. Here, the underwriting was a physical act. A man would write his name under the details of a voyage, literally underwriting the risk in exchange for a premium. Imagine the scene: the clinking of porcelain cups, the haze of tobacco smoke drifting lazily toward the ceiling, and the slow, deliberate signing of names on thick paper, spreading the risk of a voyage to the East Indies among many, dissolving the danger into the collective wealth of the room. Fact 8. As the 18th century dawned, bringing with it the Age of Reason, the first life insurance society, the Amicable Society for a Perpetual Assurance Office, was founded under a charter from Queen Anne. Unlike the rough estimations of the past, this society required an annual payment, a steady contribution to the collective stability. The members, limited in number, would gather in solemn meetings, their powdered wigs and velvet coats absorbing the candlelight, to discuss the distribution of funds to the families of those who had passed. It was a slow, bureaucratic process, devoid of passion, but full of purpose, creating a mechanism where the inevitable end of life was met not with financial chaos, but with a prearranged, orderly transfer of resources, as reliable as the turning of the seasons. Fact 9. The calculation of risk required more than just intuition. It demanded the cool, unfeeling logic of mathematics, provided by Edmund Halley and later Richard Price. Halley, looking away from the stars and down to the mortality tables of Breslau, began to calculate the probability of life and death with actuarial precision. Visualize him sitting at a heavy wooden desk, surrounded by stacks of paper filled with rows of numbers, the candlelight flickering over the columns of data. He was not predicting the fate of a specific soul, but the statistical flow of a population, turning the organic messiness of human existence into smooth curves and predictable averages, a comforting abstraction that allowed insurance to be priced with the steady certainty of a clock ticking in a quiet room. Fact 10. By the mid-18th century, the concept of the mutual had taken firm root, exemplified by the Equitable Life Assurance Society, which introduced the concept of premiums based on age and health. This was the standardization of stability, a move away from gambling and toward a scientific approach to security. The actuaries would sit in silence, consulting their ledgers, determining that a man of 40 years required a different calculation than a man of 20. It was a dry, dispassionate assessment carried out in hushed offices where the only sound was the scratching of pens and the turning of pages, building a fortress of paper and numbers that stood as a barrier against the uncertainties of the future, ensuring that life, no matter how fragile, could be measured, managed, and insured. Fact 11. Drifting across the Atlantic to the cobblestone streets of Philadelphia, we encounter the quiet innovation of the Philadelphia Contribution Ship, founded by Benjamin Franklin in 1752. This organization introduced the hand-in-hand fire mark, a heavy leaden badge bearing 4 clasped hands, which was affixed to the brick facades of insured homes. Imagine the weight of that lead shield, cool and solid, against the rough red clay of the brickwork, serving as a silent guardian through the humid summers and snowy winters of the colonies. The society employed surveyors who would slowly walk the property, checking the thickness of the walls and the sweeping of the chimneys, ensuring that the risk was managed not just by paper, but by the physical inspection of stone and mortar. It was a local, tactile form of assurance, where neighbors pooled their resources to protect the wooden beams and shingled roofs that sheltered their sleep.
Fact 12. As the Industrial Revolution began to fill the skies with the gray, heavy smoke of progress, the nature of risk shifted from the wind of the sea to the pressure of steam. In 1866, the Hartford Steam Boiler Inspection and Insurance Company was formed to address the latent power contained within the iron bellies of industrial boilers. Visualize the interior of a 19th century textile mill, where the air was thick with cotton dust and the rhythmic thrumming of the looms created a hypnotic, steady vibration. The insurance inspector would arrive with his tools, a methodical figure in a soot-stained coat, tapping the rivets of the boiler with a small hammer, listening for the dull thud of weakness or the sharp ring of integrity. His work was slow and deliberate, a quiet communion with the metal, ensuring that the pressure remained contained. allowing the great wheels of industry to turn without the sudden, catastrophic release of steam.
Fact 13. Returning to the hallowed halls of Lloyd's of London, which had by the 19th century evolved from a coffee house into a regulated marketplace, we find the installation of the lutein bell. Salvaged from a shipwreck, this heavy bronze bell hung in the center of the underwriting room, its purpose to signal news of overdue ships. When a vessel arrived safely, the bell would ring twice. When a vessel was lost, it would ring once. Imagine the resonance of that single low note hanging in the air of the great room, a sound that vibrated through the wooden desks and the floorboards, briefly pausing the scratching of quills. The underwriters would hear the tone, mark their ledgers with a steady hand, and then continue their work, the sound fading into the ambient murmur of commerce, a solemn auditory marker of the sea's indifference. Fact 14. With the expansion of the railways, the concept of accident insurance emerged, birthed by the Railway Passengers Assurance Company in 1848. As travelers boarded the steam trains, settling into the plush velvet seats of the carriages, they could purchase a ticket that ensured their safety for the duration of the journey. Visualize the heavy cardstock of the insurance ticket, printed with ornate Victorian typography, held securely in a gloved hand as the train began its slow, rhythmic chug out of the station. The landscape would blur into a stream of green and gray outside the window, the repetitive clatter of the wheels on the tracks acting as a lullaby. The traveler, clutching this small piece of paper, could close their eyes and drift into slumber, trusting that the financial consequences of any derailment or collision had already been calculated, priced, and filed away in a distant office. Fact 15. In the dense, fog-laden streets of Victorian London, a new form of protection arose for the working class: industrial life insurance, popularized by the Prudential. This system relied on the penny policy, where agents would physically visit the homes of the policyholders every week to collect a few copper coins. Picture the man from the Prue, a figure in a dark coat and hat walking his assigned route through the damp, gas-lit neighborhoods, his leather bag heavy with ledgers and pennies. He would knock softly on the wooden doors, a weekly ritual as reliable as the church bells. The transaction was brief and quiet, the exchange of a coin, the marking of a book, a micro-interaction that slowly built a reservoir of security for the families within, ensuring that even in the humblest of homes, there was a preparation for the inevitable end. Fact 16. As the scale of risk grew too large for any single company to bear, the concept of reinsurance was formalized with the founding of Cologne Re in 1846. This was the insurance of insurance companies, a layer of protection hidden deep behind the scenes. It was an abstract, administrative world, far removed from the fires and shipwrecks it ultimately covered. Imagine a quiet room in a German counting house where clerks with green visors transferred columns of numbers from one ledger to another, effectively slicing up a massive risk into thin, manageable layers. Like a geologic process, the weight of a potential catastrophe was distributed across a vast, invisible bedrock of capital, ensuring that no single shock could cause the entire structure to crumble. It was the silent partner of the industry, operating in the background with a steady, bureaucratic hum. Fact 17. The assessment of fire risk became a visual art form with the creation of the Sanborn maps in the United States during the late 19th century. These were large, detailed atlases that mapped every building in a city, color-coded to indicate their construction material. Visualize the mapmaker leaning over a drafting table in a sunlit room, carefully applying a wash of blue watercolor for stone buildings, red for brick, and yellow for wood. The smell of the paper and the ink would fill the air as he drew the outlines of porches, windows, and skylights. These maps were beautiful, static representations of the city, used by underwriters to assess risk without ever leaving their desks. They could trace a finger along a paper street, seeing the density of the wood and the proximity of the water mains, a peaceful bird's eye view of the urban landscape frozen in time. Fact 18. With the rise of the large corporation came the need for fidelity guarantee insurance, a precursor to modern bonding, which protected companies against the dishonesty of their own employees. This niche focused on the quiet internal risks of the counting house, the clerk who might be tempted to alter a figure or pocket a coin. The underwriting process involved a detailed examination of the employee's character and habits. Imagine the slow, careful review of reference letters, the scrutiny of handwriting samples for signs of instability, the quiet interviews conducted in plush offices. It was a psychological assessment turned into a financial product, a way to place a price tag on trust itself. The policy became a silent observer in the office, a guarantee that the rows of figures in the ledger would remain true, maintaining the sterile, orderly environment of the workplace. Fact 19. In the agricultural heartlands, the risk was not fire or theft, but the capricious nature of the sky, leading to the development of crop hail insurance. Farmers, whose livelihoods depended on the delicate growth of wheat and corn, sought protection against the sudden violence of a summer storm. Visualize the vast golden fields swaying gently in the breeze, the sun warming the earth, while a dark cloud gathers on the horizon. The insurance policy was a promise that even if the ice fell and flattened the stalks, the season would not be a total loss. The assessment of damage was a slow, walking process. An adjuster would pace through the rows, counting the bruised leaves and the broken stems, calculating the percentage of loss with a notebook and pencil. It was a partnership between the soil and the spreadsheet, bringing the predictability of finance to the wild unpredictability of nature. Fact 20. By the end of the 19th century, the concept of burglary insurance began to take hold, offering peace of mind to the affluent households filled with silver and silk. This type of coverage required a detailed inventory of possessions, a slow cataloging of every spoon, vase, and painting. Picture the homeowner moving room to room in the evening, the lamp casting long shadows, writing down the description of a grandfather clock or a velvet armchair. The policy was a document that acknowledged the value of the material world, creating a barrier of compensation around the home. It allowed the residents to lock their heavy oak doors, turn down the gas lamps, and retire to their beds, enveloped in the heavy, silent comfort of knowing that their sanctuary was underwritten, secure against the intrusion of the night. Fact 21. As the 20th century opened, the quiet streets began to echo with the new mechanical sputter of the internal combustion engine, necessitating the birth of automobile insurance. In 1897, the Travelers Insurance Company issued the very first policy to a man named Gilbert Loomis, a mechanic who built his own car. Visualize the scene. A single horse-drawn carriage sharing the road with a primitive, sputtering vehicle, the driver gripping the tiller with leather-gloved hands. The policy was a physical document, heavy and typed on thick paper, which Loomis would have tucked into a secure drawer at home. It represented a new kind of risk, kinetic energy, and promised that if his machine were to collide with a fence or a wagon, the financial shock would be absorbed by the company. It was the beginning of a world where every rotation of a rubber tire was backed by a silent mathematical guarantee of repair. Fact 22. With the tragedy of the Titanic in 1912, the world was forced to confront the limits of maritime safety, leading to a profound shift in excess of loss reinsurance. The ship was insured for $1 million, a colossal sum that rippled through the London market, requiring hundreds of syndicates to pay out. Imagine the somber atmosphere in the underwriting room at Lloyd's when the news was confirmed. The lutein bell ringing once, a single mournful toll that hung in the air. The payment of the claim was a slow administrative process, involving the transfer of funds from countless small ledgers into one massive settlement. It was a demonstration of the system's resilience, where the financial ruin of a disaster was pulverized into manageable fragments, absorbed by the collective market like water into a sponge, leaving the global economy dry and intact. Fact 23. In 1911, the concept of national insurance was introduced in Britain, a massive bureaucratic machine designed to protect the working class from sickness and unemployment. This was the stamp system, where workers would purchase a small adhesive stamp each week to affix to their contribution card. Visualize the millions of cards, paper rectangles carried in pockets and purses across the nation, being slowly filled row by row with colorful stamps. The act of licking the stamp and pressing it onto the card became a weekly ritual for the entire population, a sticky, tactile connection to the state. These cards were then collected and stored in vast, silent archives, filing cabinets stretching for miles. containing the health and security of a generation in paper form, a slow-moving river of administrative care. Fact 24. Across the ocean, in the United States, the concept of workers' compensation began to take legislative shape, moving liability from the courts to a no-fault insurance system. Before this, an injured worker had to sue their employer, a loud and contentious process. The new system was quiet and automatic. Imagine a factory floor where a worker injures his hand. Instead of a courtroom drama, there is simply a form to be filled out. A clerk in a back office receives the paper, checks the details against a schedule of benefits. A finger is worth this much, a hand is worth that much, and issues a check. It transformed the chaotic suffering of industrial accidents into a predictable, administrative table of values, a cold but reliable comfort that ensured bills were paid while the machinery of production continued its rhythmic hum. Fact 25. The 1920s saw the rise of the moral hazard debate in insurance, particularly regarding fire and theft, leading to stricter underwriting guidelines. Insurers began to require more detailed applications, probing the character of the insured. Picture a man sitting in his study, the lamp casting a warm circle of light on his desk as he fills out a lengthy questionnaire. He must detail his financial history, his previous losses, his very standing in the community. The pen scratches across the paper, recording the minute details of his life. This document would then be sent to a distant office, where an underwriter, a stranger in a gray suit, would read it slowly, judging whether this man was good risk. It was a silent judgment, a vetting process that filtered the population through a sieve of probability and reputation. Fact 26. During the Great Depression, the stability of the insurance industry provided a stark contrast to the volatility of the stock market. While banks failed and lines formed around the block, life insurance companies largely remained solvent, their conservative investment strategies acting as a seawall against the economic storm. Visualize the interior of a 1930s insurance office. High ceilings, marble floors, and rows of desks where clerks continued to process premium payments. For many families, the insurance policy was the only asset that retained its value, a piece of paper that could be borrowed against to buy bread or pay rent. It was a slow, steady anchor in a churning ocean of poverty, a financial instrument designed not for quick profit, but for long-term survival, ticking along reliably while the rest of the economy collapsed. Fact 27. The mechanization of the actuary's work advanced with the introduction of punch card machines by companies like IBM in the mid-20th century. Before computers, data was processed by sorting physical cards with holes punched in them to represent information. Imagine a room filled with these large metal machines, the air vibrating with the rhythmic clack, clack, clack of the sorters. An operator would feed a stack of stiff paper cards into the hopper, and the machine would shuffle them into pockets based on age, location, or risk class. It was a physical sorting of humanity, a loud mechanical process that turned millions of individual lives into stacks of statistics. The sound was hypnotic, a repetitive industrial percussion that underpinned the calculation of premiums, automating the tedious work of prediction. Fact 28. In 1935, the United States passed the Social Security Act, creating the largest insurance program in history. This was insurance on a geologic scale, covering the old age of an entire nation. The administration of this program required the assignment of a 9-digit number to every citizen, a permanent digital tattoo for the ledger. Visualize the printing presses running day and night to create the first batch of Social Security cards, millions of small blue paper cards destined for wallets across the country. The intake process involved thousands of clerks in a massive hall in Baltimore, manually typing names and numbers onto index cards, filing them into endless rows of metal cabinets. It was a masterpiece of boredom and logistics, a system so vast that it became invisible, a background hum of security that promised a check in the mail when the working years were done. Fact 29. The mid-20th century also saw the standardization of the shipping container, which revolutionized marine insurance by reducing theft and damage. Before containers, goods were loaded as break bulk, sacks and crates manhandled by stevedores. With containers, the cargo was sealed in a steel box at the factory and not opened until the destination. Imagine the insurer's relief at this metal uniformity. A policy no longer had to account for a crate of whiskey accidentally breaking on the docks. The risk was contained, literally within a corrugated steel rectangle. The ship became a carrier of geometry, stacking these identical boxes in towering, colorful columns. The underwriter's job became simpler, the variables reduced, the chaos of the port replaced by the modular certainty of the container, a silent, locking mechanism for global trade. Fact 30. As the atomic age dawned, the insurance industry faced the uninsurable risk of nuclear fallout, leading to the Price-Anderson Act of 1957. Private insurers could not calculate the cost of a nuclear disaster, so the government stepped in to provide a backstop. Visualize the meeting rooms where this was negotiated. Men in dark suits discussing the half-life of uranium and the radius of destruction in quiet, measured tones. They were attempting to put a price on the apocalypse. The solution was a pooling of liability, a complex legal structure that allowed nuclear power plants to operate. It was a contract with the unknown, a paper shield against the invisible fire of the atom, ensuring that the lights could stay on while the financial risk was suspended in a carefully constructed web of legislation and indemnity. Fact 31. As humanity turned its gaze upward, the insurance industry quietly followed, extending its reach into the vacuum of space with the coverage of the early bird satellite in 1965. This marked the birth of satellite insurance, a sector where the risk is concentrated in the silent, fiery minutes of ignition and orbital insertion. Visualize the control room, a windowless sanctuary of humming servers and glowing monitors where underwriters watch the telemetry, data stream, and green lines across black screens. The policy does not cover the drama of the launch, but the mundane functionality of the transponders. It ensures that if the hardware drifts into a useless orbit, the financial investment is returned. It is a calculation of gravity and failure rates, a contract signed on Earth to protect circuitry floating in the cold, silent stillness of the geostationary belt, thousands of miles above the weather. Fact 32. In the 1970s, a structural shift occurred in the corporate world with the popularization of captive insurance companies, particularly in the calm, turquoise-ringed islands of Bermuda. Large corporations, realizing their risks were too specific for the general market, began to insure themselves by forming wholly owned subsidiaries. Imagine the air-conditioned hush of a boardroom in Hamilton, where the blinds are drawn against the bright tropical sun. Here, the risk does not leave the company. It is merely transferred from one ledger to another within the same corporate family. It is a closed loop of finance, a sophisticated form of self-reliance where premiums are paid to oneself, accumulating in tax-efficient reservoirs. The atmosphere is one of dense, bureaucratic peace, where the only waves are the gentle fluctuations of the balance sheet, managed by accountants in crisp white shirts. Fact 33. The 1980s introduced a digital revolution to risk assessment with the advent of catastrophe modeling, a move away from historical tables toward computer simulation. Before this, insurers looked backward at past storms. Now, they looked forward into digital winds. Visualize the early workstations, beige boxes with heavy cathode ray tube monitors, sitting in rows in a carpeted office. An analyst types a command, and the machine begins to simulate 10,000 years of artificial hurricanes, generating hypothetical paths across a pixelated map. The cooling fans of the computers whir with a steady drone, a modern replacement for the scratching of the actuary's pen. This process turns the chaotic violence of nature into a clean, statistical probability distribution, allowing the company to price the wind before it even begins to blow, creating a buffer of code against the storm. Fact 34. Parallel to the rise of technology was the wave of demutualization that swept through the industry in the late 20th century, transforming mutual societies owned by policyholders into public stock companies. This was a massive administrative metamorphosis involving the mailing of millions of information packets to members. Picture the postal sorting facilities filled with bins of white envelopes, each containing a prospectus explaining the conversion of membership rights into shares of stock. The process was slow and legalistic, a shuffling of ownership that took years to complete. For the policyholder, it meant a change in paperwork. For the institution, it meant access to capital markets. It was the sound of tradition being filed away, replaced by the ticker tape and the quarterly report, a modernization of structure that took place entirely in the fine print. Fact 35. As corporate litigation became more complex, directors and officers, D&O liability insurance, became a standard fixture of the executive suite. This coverage protects the personal assets of company leaders from lawsuits alleging wrongful acts in their management. Imagine the interior of a high-rise conference room, the city lights blurring in the rain against the glass, where a board of directors sits around a mahogany table. They are making decisions, approving mergers, signing statements, actions that carry immense weight. The D&O policy acts as an invisible shield around each leather chair, promising that if a signature leads to a lawsuit years down the line, the legal fees will be covered. It is the insurance of decision-making itself, a silent partner in the governance of commerce, allowing the business of the world to proceed without the paralyzing fear of personal ruin. Fact 36. In the realm of healthcare, the latter half of the century saw the rise of the Health Maintenance Organization, or HMO, which sought to manage costs through a structured network of providers. This system introduced the gatekeeper model, where a patient's journey began with a primary care physician. Visualize the waiting room with its stack of magazines and the low hum of an aquarium, where the administrative process begins. The referral form is the currency of this realm, a triplicate piece of paper that must be signed and stamped to authorize a visit to a specialist. It is a bureaucracy of care, where access is regulated by protocols and guidelines. The insurance here is not just a payer, but a manager, creating a structured pathway through the medical system, defined by pre-approvals, co-payments, and the quiet rustle of medical records. Fact 37. The globalization of finance required new regulatory standards, culminating in frameworks like Solvency II in Europe, which codified the amount of capital insurers must hold. This is the realm of pure compliance, a dense forest of rules and ratios. Imagine a compliance officer sitting in a glass-walled office in Brussels or London, surrounded by binders of regulations that stack from the floor to the desk. The task is to calculate the solvency capital requirement, a stress test that imagines the worst-case scenarios for the economy. It is a dry intellectual exercise, ensuring that even if the stock market crashes and the interest rates invert, the fortress of the insurance company will remain standing. The work is endless and repetitive, a constant tuning of the financial engine to meet the strict tolerances of the law. Fact 38. The blurring lines between banking and insurance gave rise to the credit default swap, CDS, in the 1990s, a financial instrument that acted like insurance on bonds. While technically a derivative, its function was to transfer the risk of default. Visualize the trading floor, not in a moment of panic, but in the routine processing of contracts. A trader agrees to pay a small, periodic fee, like a premium, in exchange for a payout if a specific company fails to pay its debts. These contracts were not stored in a vault, but as digital entries in a clearing system, a vast web of promises, connecting banks and insurers globally. It was the commodification of trust, allowing the risk of a loan to be sliced, packaged, and sold to a counterparty thousands of miles away, all through the silent flicker of fiber optic cables. Fact 39. A return to the elemental forces of nature brought about parametric insurance, a product that dispenses with the human loss adjuster entirely. Instead of someone visiting a site to assess damage, the policy pays out based on a trigger, such as wind speed or rainfall magnitude. Imagine a remote weather station on a Caribbean island, a white box on a pole, its anemometer spinning silently in the breeze. Inside, a sensor records the wind speed, 100 miles per hour. The moment the data crosses that threshold, a computer server on the mainland automatically initiates a wire transfer. There is no claim form, no argument, no delay. It is a binary form of protection, a direct link between the physical measurement of the atmosphere and the movement of capital, operating with the cold, efficient logic of an algorithm. Fact 40. As the millennium approached, the insurance industry faced the Y2K bug, a fear that legacy computer systems would fail when the date rolled over to the year 2000. This created a demand for specialized liability coverage to protect against digital business interruption. Visualize the basement of a large bank in 1999, where programmers with coffee mugs worked late into the night, combing through millions of lines of COBOL code. The insurance policy sat in the background, a contingency plan for the turning of the calendar. When the clock finally struck midnight and the world did not end, the policy expired quietly, having served its purpose as a financial tranquilizer. It was a unique moment where the risk was purely temporal, a fear of time itself managed and mitigated by the steady, unblinking assurance of the insurance contract. Fact 41. As the new millennium established its rhythm, the assessment of risk migrated from the static page to the moving vehicle with the introduction of telematics. This technology involves a small device, often referred to as a black box, installed beneath the dashboard of an automobile. Visualize the device sitting quietly in the dark recesses of the car's interior, its accelerometer measuring the gentle forces of motion. It records the gradual deceleration at a stop sign, the smoothness of a turn, and the consistency of speed on the highway. This data is transmitted not as a story, but as a stream of binary code sent through the cellular network to a distant server. It turns the act of driving into a digital graph, where a safe driver is defined by the absence of sharp spikes in the data, a mathematical portrait of caution drawn in real time. Fact 42. Drifting from the connected car to the connected home, the industry began to embrace the Internet of Things, IoT, placing sensors in the quiet, unseen corners of domestic life. Consider the water leak detector, a small white plastic square placed silently beneath a kitchen sink or behind a washing machine. It sits there for years, waiting in the darkness, its only function to sense the presence of moisture. Unlike a smoke alarm that shrieks, these modern sentinels communicate in silence, sending a signal to a smartphone and, in some cases, automatically triggering a valve to shut off the main water supply. It is a preemptive form of insurance where the claim is prevented before it can occur. A system of quiet vigilance that protects the floorboards and the drywall from the slow damaging creep of water. Fact 43. In the developing economies of the 21st century, the concept of micro-insurance emerged, utilizing the ubiquity of mobile phones to offer protection in minute increments. This is insurance for the very small, a policy that costs pennies and covers a single day's crop or a specific bus journey. Visualize a farmer standing in a field, the sun beating down on the soil, tapping a few buttons on an old keypad phone. The transaction is invisible and instantaneous, the premium deducted from their airtime balance. There is no paper policy, no handshake, no office to visit, just a digital confirmation message glowing on a small monochrome screen. It is the atomization of risk, breaking the heavy monolith of traditional insurance into tiny, digestible particles that can be distributed through the airwaves to the most remote corners of the world. Fact 44. As the value of digital assets surpassed physical ones, the market for cyber insurance matured, evolving to cover the quiet but devastating threat of data breaches. This coverage is less about repairing a wall and more about managing a crisis of information. Visualize the response to a ransomware event. It does not involve sirens, but a conference call in a hushed room. The insurance policy activates a team of digital forensics experts who sift through terabytes of server logs looking for the digital footprints of the intruder. It covers the cost of the notification letters sent to customers, thousands of envelopes moving through the mail, and the credit monitoring services that follow. It is a bureaucratic cleanup operation for a crime that leaves no physical trace, a financial cushion for the intangible world of servers and clouds. Fact 45. The intersection of Wall Street and the insurance sector deepened with the proliferation of catastrophe bonds, or cat bonds, which allow investors to bet directly on the weather. These are complex financial instruments where the principal is at risk if a specific natural event occurs. Imagine a high-frequency trading desk where a bond is linked to the wind speed of a hurricane in Florida. If the wind speed stays below 130 miles per hour, the investor earns a steady coupon. If it exceeds that limit, the money is transferred to the insurance company to pay claims. It turns the fury of a storm into a conditional logic statement in a contract, creating a direct pipeline between the chaotic atmosphere and the orderly, climate-controlled environment of the capital markets. Fact 46. With the mapping of the human genome, the shadow of genetic testing began to loom over the life insurance industry, raising questions about adverse selection. This is the concern that individuals who know they have a genetic predisposition to illness will buy more insurance. The industry's response has been a slow, regulatory dance, governed in places like the U.S. by the Genetic Information Non-Discrimination Act, GINA. Visualize the double helix of DNA, a microscopic ladder of information, effectively being firewalled from the underwriter's view. The application process remains deliberately blind to this data, relying instead on traditional markers like blood pressure and family history. It is a conscious decision to ignore the deepest level of biological truth in favor of a shared social pool of ignorance, maintaining the fairness of the collective risk. Fact 47. The architecture of trust itself began to change with the arrival of blockchain technology and the concept of smart contracts. These are self-executing policies written in code on a distributed ledger, immutable and transparent. Imagine a flight delay policy built on the Ethereum network. There is no claims adjuster involved. The contract is connected to a global air traffic database. When the flight is recorded as canceled, the code automatically releases the funds to the policyholder's digital wallet. It is a trustless interaction where the reliability comes not from the reputation of a company, but from the mathematical certainty of the cryptographic block. The process is cold, efficient, and inevitable, removing the friction of human judgment from the mechanics of indemnity.
Fact 48. As the automobile begins to transition from human control to autonomy, the nature of liability shifts from the driver's foot to the manufacturer's algorithm. In a world of self-driving cars, the accident becomes a product failure. Visualize the sensors of an autonomous vehicle, LiDAR, radar, and cameras, spinning silently, creating a 3D point cloud of the world. The insurance risk is no longer about a distracted teenager, but about a line of code that misinterprets a shadow. The underwriting process moves from analyzing motor vehicle records to auditing software quality and sensor redundancy. It is a fundamental pivot where the insurance industry begins to ensure the machine's decisions rather than the human's reflexes, entering a new era of product liability for the robotic age.
Fact 49. The digital era also saw a return to the roots of the industry with peer-to-peer, P2P insurance models, which use technology to recreate the communal feel of the ancient guilds. Companies like Lemonade introduced the concept of social circles or give-back pools. Visualize a digital pot of money represented by a graphic on a smartphone app. A group of policyholders pays their premiums into this pool. If they make no claims, the leftover money is not kept as profit, but donated to a charity of their choice. It gamifies the concept of moral hazard, using the gentle pressure of social good to discourage fraud. It is a softening of the corporate face of insurance, wrapping the cold calculus of risk in a warm, user-friendly interface that mimics the mutual aid of the past. Fact 50. Finally, we arrive at the present dominance of algorithmic underwriting, where the black box of artificial intelligence determines the price of protection in milliseconds. The human underwriter who once sat with a quill or a fountain pen, considering the character of the applicant, has been replaced by a server farm. When a user requests a quote online, the system instantly queries dozens of databases, credit scores, property maps, claims history, social media data. Visualize the flow of electricity through the silicon chips. A silent, lightning-fast assessment that condenses a person's entire risk profile into a single dollar amount. It is the ultimate realization of the actuary's dream, a frictionless, emotionless, and instantaneous calculation of the future, delivered quietly to a glowing screen in the palm of a hand. Fact 51. We turn our attention now to the slow, dusty world of title insurance, a form of protection that looks exclusively backward rather than forward. Unlike other policies that fear the future, this one fears the past, specifically the cloud on a title. Visualize the interior of a county clerk's office, a room smelling of aging paper and binding glue, where heavy ledger books are stacked on floor-to-ceiling shelves. A title abstractor sits at a wooden table, turning the pages with a rhythmic swish, tracing the ownership of a plot of land back through the decades. They are looking for the ghost of an unpaid mortgage or a forgotten heir from a century ago. The policy provides a guarantee that the land under one's feet truly belongs to the deed holder, ensuring against the quiet, historical resurfacing of a claim that was thought to be buried in the archives of time. Fact 52. In the realm of banking, the Great Depression birthed the Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation, FDIC, an institution designed to manufacture silence where there once was panic. The symbol of this insurance is the small, metallic, or decal plaque found at the teller's window, often overlooked by the customer. Visualize the lobby of an old bank, the marble floors echoing with soft footsteps, the brass railings polished to a shine. The plaque is a static promise that even if the bank's vaults were to empty, the government would replenish the accounts. It is a psychological insurance, a backstop that prevents the run on the bank by removing the fear of loss. It allows the depositor to leave their life savings in the hands of strangers and sleep soundly, trusting in the invisible, bureaucratic net that underpins the entire monetary system. Fact 53. The preservation of beauty requires a specific kind of calculation known as fine art insurance. This is a niche where the risk is measured in lumens of light and percentages of relative humidity. Imagine the storeroom of a museum, a space kept in perpetual twilight to protect the pigments of Renaissance oils. The underwriter does not just look at the price tag of a painting, but at the climate control systems of the gallery. They examine the condition report, a document that maps every existing crack in the varnish and every speck of dust on the frame. The policy covers the agreed value of the masterpiece, ensuring that if a pipe bursts or a fire starts, the financial value of the art remains intact, even if the brushstrokes themselves are lost to the chemistry of heat and water. Fact 54. Similarly, the world of oenology requires protection through wine insurance, covering the slow maturation of vintage bottles in deep subterranean cellars. Here, the risk is not just breakage, but cork taint or a failure of the cooling unit. Visualize the rows of dusty bottles resting on their sides in the dark, The air cool and damp, the silence absolute. The insurance inspector checks the provenance of the collection, verifying the seals and the labels. It is a policy for patience, covering an asset that must sit undisturbed for decades to reach its peak. The underwriter is effectively insuring the passage of time itself, guaranteeing that the investment sleeping in the glass will eventually yield a return, provided the temperature remains constant and the cork remains true. Fact 55. The equine mortality policy brings insurance into the warm, hay-scented environment of the stable. For the owners of thoroughbred racehorses, the animal is both a living creature and a fragile asset. Visualize the veterinarian conducting a pre-insurance examination, their hands moving slowly over the horse's legs, checking the tendons for heat, listening to the heart with a stethoscope. The barn is quiet, save for the chewing of straw and the shifting of hooves. The policy covers the animal against death, disease, or infertility. It is a high-value contract written on the biology of a specific creature, acknowledging the precarious nature of life. The paperwork is filed away while the horse stands in its stall, $1 million investment, breathing softly in the pre-dawn light. Fact 56. There exists a ghostly sector of the industry known as runoff management, which deals with insurance companies that have ceased to write new business but must still pay old claims. These are the zombie insurers, existing only to settle the debts of the past. Imagine an office where the phone rarely rings and the staff is solely dedicated to closing files that have been open for years, perhaps relating to asbestos exposure from a factory that closed in the 1980s. The work is a slow, methodical winding down, a long tail of liability that stretches out over decades. It is the administrative hospice of the financial world, where the goal is to reach zero, to pay the final dollar on the final claim, and turn off the lights for the very last time. Fact 57. Deep in the permafrost of the Arctic Circle lies the ultimate insurance policy for the planet's biodiversity, the Svalbard Global Seed Vault. While not a financial contract, it operates on the same principle of reinsurance, a backup for the world's crop banks. Visualize the entrance, a concrete wedge protruding from the snow-covered mountain, illuminated by a piece of fiber optic art. Inside, the tunnel descends into the earth, leading to a chamber kept at a constant minus 18 degrees Celsius. Here, millions of seeds rest in black boxes, wrapped in foil, sleeping in the darkness. There is no staff, only the hum of the cooling systems and the silence of the ice. It is a vault designed to withstand the collapse of civilization, a frozen guarantee that the genetic code of agriculture will survive the catastrophes of the future. Fact 58. Extending the timeline of risk even further is the field of nuclear waste management, which requires a form of insurance that lasts for 10,000 years. The Human Interference Task Force has grappled with how to mark waste sites so that future generations who may not speak our languages will know to stay away. Visualize the proposed designs: fields of menacing thorn sculptures made of concrete, or vast, forbidding earthworks designed to instill a primal sense of dread. The insurance here is semiotic. It is an attempt to communicate danger across deep time. The actuaries of the atom must calculate the stability of geology itself, ensuring against the intrusion of water or the curiosity of our distant descendants, trying to create a warning label that outlasts history. Fact 59. In the wake of global health crises, the World Bank developed the Pandemic Emergency Financing Facility, which utilizes pandemic bonds. These are parametric instruments that pay out not based on damage assessment, but on the cold, hard data of infection rates. Imagine a server tracking the number of confirmed cases of a virus in specific countries. When the number crosses a predetermined threshold, the bond triggers. The investors lose their principal, and the money is instantly released to aid organizations. It is the grim mathematics of contagion, where a biological plague is converted into a financial if-then statement. The process is devoid of emotion, a mechanical response to suffering that ensures funding arrives with the speed of a wire transfer rather than the slowness of a political debate. Fact 60. Finally, we touch upon the legal bedrock of all insurance contracts, the concept of force majeure, or superior force. This is the clause that addresses events beyond human control, the acts of God. Visualize the fine print at the bottom of a contract, the dense paragraphs of text that define the limits of liability. It lists the earthquake, the flood, the war, and the embargo. When such an event occurs, the normal flow of obligation is suspended. It is a legal acknowledgement of the universe's chaos, a humble admission that there are forces greater than any balance sheet can absorb. The force majeure clause is the silence at the end of the contract, the space where the lawyer puts down the pen and admits that, in the face of the absolute, the insurance stops. Fact 61. To truly understand the stability of insurance, one must retreat to the year 1494 and the quiet study of Luca Pacioli, a Franciscan friar who codified the system of double-entry bookkeeping. This is the mathematical heartbeat of all finance. The concept is beautifully simple, yet infinitely repetitive. For every debit, there must be a corresponding credit. Visualize the open ledger on a Renaissance desk, the parchment, yellowed and heavy. The scribe enters a value on the left side, the dare, and immediately enters an equal value on the right side, the aver. It is a system of perfect symmetry, a closed loop where nothing is ever lost, only transferred. This equilibrium provides a deep sense of order, ensuring that at the end of the day, when the sun sets and the candles are lit, the sum of the world's transactions balances perfectly to zero. Fact 62. For centuries, the physical act of recording these risks was a tactile experience involving the quill and the inkwell. The insurance clerk of the 18th century lived a life defined by the scratching of the nib against the paper. Visualize the viscosity of the iron gall ink, dark and permanent, flowing onto the page to record a premium payment. Once the entry was made, the clerk would not blow on it, but rather sprinkle pounce, fine sand, or cuttlefish bone over the wet letters to dry them. The sound of the sand being shaken from the page was the background static of the office. This slow, deliberate process ensured that the record was indelible, creating a physical history of obligation that could survive for hundreds of years, stored in the cool, dry air of the archives. Fact 63. As the ledgers filled, the concept of the audit trail emerged, a metaphorical thread that allows a financial detective to trace a transaction back to its origin. In the context of insurance, this means verifying that the premium paid matches the policy issued. Visualize the auditor's work, a silent, methodical journey through the past. They sit in a room filled with boxes, pulling out a faded receipt, checking the date, and finding the corresponding entry in the main journal. It is a process of confirmation, marked by the small red check mark placed next to a number. This tiny symbol is a seal of truth, a visual indication that the reality of the physical world aligns perfectly with the abstraction of the financial record, creating a chain of evidence that remains unbroken. Fact 64. The preservation of these critical records led to the engineering of the fireproof safe, the iron heart of every insurance office. By the mid-19th century, companies like Chubb were manufacturing heavy, steel-walled sanctuaries for the ledgers. Visualize the sheer weight of the door swinging shut on precision hinges with a low, heavy thrum. The locking mechanism involves a series of brass tumblers clicking into place, a sound of absolute finality. Inside, the air is still and insulated with a layer of sawdust or alum, designed to keep the temperature low even if the building burns. The ledger sleeps inside this steel womb, protected from the chaos of the outside world, ensuring that the memory of the company survives even the most destructive of nights. Fact 65. A critical concept in the valuation of insured assets is depreciation, the mathematical acknowledgement of the slow, inevitable decay of matter. Everything that is built will eventually fade, and the accountant captures this through a steady annual reduction in value. Visualize a factory machine painted gray, humming in a corner. Each year, the accountant makes an entry that reduces its worth by a precise percentage, perhaps 5%. It is a melancholy but orderly calculation, a financial mirroring of entropy. The asset does not break. It simply writes down, losing its value in the books, just as it loses its shine in the world. This slow erosion is tracked in silence, a recognition that time itself is a cost that must be amortized over the useful life of the object. Fact 66. To ensure that all companies spoke the same financial language, the industry adopted Generally Accepted Accounting Principles, or GAAP. This is the rulebook of reality for the accountant. It creates a standardized world where definitions are rigid and unchangeable. Visualize a library of thick, bound volumes containing these standards, pages and pages of text defining what counts as revenue and what counts as a liability. There is no room for interpretation or poetry here, only the strict syntax of compliance. The adherence to these rules allows an insurer in London to understand the books of an insurer in New York. It is a global consensus on boredom, a shared framework of bureaucratic truth that keeps the wheels of international finance turning without friction. Fact 67. The rhythm of the insurance world is dictated not by the calendar year, but by the fiscal year, an arbitrary segmentation of time used for reporting. For many, this cycle ends not in December, but in March or June. The closing of the books is a ritual of finality. Visualize the accounting department late at night, the office quiet except for the tapping of calculators. They are reconciling the accounts, ensuring that every penny is placed in its proper column before the deadline passes. It is a moment of suspension where the flow of business is briefly halted to take a snapshot of the company's health. Once the books are closed, they are sealed, becoming a static historical document that can never be altered, a permanent monument to the year's activity. Fact 68. The specific tool of the life insurance actuary is the mortality table, a grid of numbers that predicts the lifespan of a population. While the subject is death, the document itself is a masterpiece of dry statistics. Visualize the rows of ages 20, 21, 22, and the corresponding columns of decimal probabilities. A number like 0.012 represents the chance of survival. The actuary does not see a face, they see a curve. The smoothing of this data is done with a graduating technique, ironing out the statistical bumps to create a perfect theoretical arc of life. It is a way of viewing humanity through a filter of pure mathematics, reducing the complex emotional journey of existence into a predictable, clean, and insurable slope of data. Fact 69. Drifting from the paper to the screen, we encounter the digital revolution of the spreadsheet, first popularized by VisiCalc and then Excel. The grid is the modern canvas of the actuary. Visualize the infinite landscape of cells, row after row, column after column, glowing softly in green and white. The cursor blinks steadily, waiting for input. The beauty of the spreadsheet lies in its formulas. Change one number in cell A1 and 1,000 other numbers in the sheet instantly update, cascading down the screen like a digital waterfall. It is a silent, responsive environment where what-if scenarios can be played out in safety, a virtual laboratory where financial stress is tested without ever risking a single real-world dollar. Fact 70. Finally, we consider the concept of the reserve, the capital that an insurance company must set aside to pay future claims. This is the financial bedrock of the industry. It is money that sits idle, invested in safe, low-yield bonds, waiting for a disaster that may not happen for decades. Visualize a vast reservoir of water, deep and still, behind a concrete dam. The water represents the capital. It is not flowing, not generating electricity, just sitting there, providing pressure and stability. The accountant's job is to measure the depth of this reservoir constantly, ensuring it never drops below the safety line. It is the discipline of saving, the rejection of immediate profit in favor of long-term survival, a quiet accumulation of resources against the uncertainty of the future. Fact 71. The physical manifestation of insurance is often the skyscraper, a structure designed to project an image of permanence and unshakable stability. In the early 20th century, companies like Metropolitan Life built towers that resembled cathedrals, clad in heavy limestone and granite. Visualize the sensation of standing at the base of such a monolith, looking up at the vertical lines of the stone rising into the gray mist. The walls are thick, insulating the interior from the noise of the street, creating a sanctuary of commerce. The revolving door at the entrance spins with a slow, heavy rhythm, a brass and glass airlock that regulates the transition from the chaotic outside world to the ordered, climate-controlled atmosphere of the lobby, where the air is always cool and smells faintly of floor wax and old paper. Fact 72. Inside these great halls, the architectural layout of the early insurance office was defined by the bullpen, a vast open-plan floor filled with identical rows of oak desks. Imagine the geometry of the room, a grid of wooden furniture stretching to the far wall, illuminated by the soft, diffuse light of milk glass pendant lamps. There were no partitions, only the rhythmic spacing of the clerks. The soundscape was a continuous, low-level hum, the shuffling of files, the scratching of pens, and later the muffled clatter of typewriter keys. It was a space of collective industry, where hundreds of individuals worked in unison, their heads bowed over ledgers, creating a visual repetition that mirrored the statistical averages they were calculating. A human machine processing risk in a steady, synchronized flow. Fact 73. Connecting these sprawling floors was the pneumatic tube system, the hidden circulatory system of the insurance building. Before email, information traveled through the walls in cylindrical capsules propelled by compressed air. Visualize the brass stations located at the end of each row of desks, the polished metal tubes disappearing into the ceiling. A clerk would roll a policy document, place it into a leather-bound capsule, and insert it into the breech. With a soft, breathy whoosh, the canister would be sucked away, traveling through miles of copper piping hidden behind the plaster, navigating the dark curves of the building's anatomy to arrive, moments later, in the central filing room. It was a silent pneumatic magic, a movement of paper driven by the invisible pressure of air. Fact 74. Deep beneath the limestone foundations, often below the level of the street and the subway, lies the archive, the memory center of the company. Here, the architecture shifts from the ornamental to the utilitarian. The ceilings are low, and the air is dry and still, conditioned to preserve the fragility of pulp and ink. Visualize the endless aisles of steel shelving stretching into the dim distance, packed tightly with cardboard boxes. Each box contains the life history of a policyholder, birth certificates, medical exams, death notices. The silence here is absolute, broken only by the hum of the ventilation system. Dust motes dance in the single beam of a flashlight as an archivist walks slowly down the row, the concrete floor absorbing the sound of their footsteps, surrounded by the sleeping weight of a million closed files. Fact 75. Ascending from the basement to the executive levels, we encounter the boardroom, a space designed to simulate a domestic library rather than an office. The walls are typically paneled in dark mahogany or walnut, wood that has absorbed the light of a century. Visualize the centerpiece, a massive table, long and polished to a mirror finish, reflecting the stillness of the room. The chairs are upholstered in heavy, tufted leather, cool to the touch, designed to support the body for hours of deliberation. In this room, the noise of the city is entirely absent, dampened by thick velvet curtains and Persian rugs. It is a hermetic seal of luxury, a space where decisions about capital are made in a hush, accompanied by the clinking of water glasses and the rustle of briefing papers. Fact 76. A specific architectural marvel in this industry is the Lloyd's of London building, designed by Richard Rogers, which inverted the traditional structure by placing the pipes and elevators on the exterior. Despite this industrial shell, the heart of the building remains the underwriting room, a vast atrium that houses the lutein bell. Visualize the contrast, the soaring, high-tech glass roof allowing natural light to flood the space, illuminating the boxes, the traditional wooden benches where underwriters still sit. The design facilitates face-to-face commerce in a vertical cathedral of stainless steel. Escalators crisscross the open air, moving people slowly between the galleries in a silent mechanical ballet. It is a space where the futuristic exoskeleton protects the ancient ritualistic core of the market. Fact 77. The windows of an insurance tower serve a specific psychological function. They offer a view of the risk without the danger. In the corner office, the glass is thick, often double or triple paned, to provide thermal and acoustic insulation. Visualize standing at such a window on the 40th floor, looking down at the traffic, which appears as a silent stream of toy cars. The rain lashes against the glass, distorting the city lights into soft glowing orbs of amber and red. But inside, the air remains dry and 72 degrees. This architectural separation creates a sense of detachment, allowing the observer to view the storm as a variable to be calculated rather than a force to be felt, safe behind the transparent shield of the curtain wall. Fact 78. The passage of time in these buildings was traditionally regulated by the master clock system. In the lobby, a large, pendulum-driven clock would serve as the primary timekeeper, electrically synchronized with smaller slave clocks in every office and hallway. Visualize the movement of the minute hand on the wall of a quiet office. It does not sweep, but jumps forward with a distinct mechanical click every 60 seconds. This audible impulse would ripple through the building, a synchronized heartbeat that ensured every clerk, actuary, and manager was operating on the exact same temporal grid. It was a pervasive, rhythmic reminder of the billable hour and the term of the policy, a mechanical structuring of the day that divided the work into precise, manageable increments. Fact 79. Security within the architecture of insurance is designed to be unobtrusive but absolute. The transition from the public lobby to the private offices involves passing through the turnstile bank. Visualize the array of waist-high barriers, brushed stainless steel, and tempered glass. The employee presents a magnetic card, and the machine responds with a soft beep and a mechanical release. The barrier slides open smoothly, allowing passage, and then closes immediately behind with a soft pneumatic hiss. It is a daily ritual of access control, a physical filtering process that ensures only the authorized can enter the sanctum of the ledger. The flow of people is regulated like the flow of water through a valve, steady, controlled, and metered. Fact 80. In the modern era, the architecture of insurance has expanded to include the data center, a building often devoid of windows entirely. These structures are the physical bodies of the digital cloud. Visualize a nondescript warehouse in a remote location, surrounded by a security fence. Inside, the environment is dominated by the hot aisle and cold aisle containment systems. Rows of black server racks hum with a constant white noise drone, the sound of thousands of cooling fans spinning in unison. The lights are often motion activated, leaving the corridors in darkness until a technician walks through. This is where the modern policy lives, not in a filing cabinet, but on a spinning hard drive platter, housed in a fortress of concrete and cooling fluid, a silent, vibrating temple of redundancy. Fact 81. The physical foundation of the insurance contract is the paper itself, specifically the high-grade bond paper traditionally used for policies. This is not the flimsy pulp of a daily newspaper, but a heavy cotton rag stock that carries a distinct weight in the hand. Visualize the texture, slightly toothy, resisting the fingertip, with a crisp, audible snap when the page is turned. This paper was chosen for its durability, designed to last for the entire human lifespan, sitting in a safe deposit box without yellowing or crumbling. The cotton fibers are tightly woven, creating a substrate that feels substantial and permanent, a physical reassurance that the promises written upon it are as solid and enduring as the material itself. Fact 82. Embedded within the very fibers of this paper is the watermark, a ghostly image, visible only when the document is held up to the light. This security feature is created during the paper-making process by a dandy roll, a wire mesh cylinder that presses a design into the wet pulp. Visualize holding the policy against a window on a rainy afternoon. As the light passes through, a translucent logo or a coat of arms slowly resolves in the paper, floating like a cloud. It is a silent mark of authenticity, a hidden layer of identity that exists within the thickness of the sheet, proving that the document is genuine without ever needing to speak. Fact 83. Upon this surface, the text is almost invariably set in a serif typeface, such as Garamond, Castellan, or Times New Roman. These fonts are characterized by the small decorative feet, or serifs, at the ends of the strokes. Visualize the letter I standing like a pillar on the page, its base firmly planted on the line. The serif guides the eye horizontally, creating a smooth, rhythmic reading experience that flows like a calm river. These typefaces were not chosen for flair, but for their authority and tradition. They are the visual language of the establishment, conveying a sense of history and gravity that a modern sans serif font simply cannot replicate. Fact 84. Framing the text of the policy is often a complex geometric border known as a guilloche pattern. This is an intricate spirograph-like design consisting of thousands of thin interlaced lines that loop over and over in a hypnotic mathematical repetition. Visualize the fine engraving of the border, the lines curving in precise, endless waves that resemble the ripples of a dark ocean. Originally designed to prevent counterfeiting, as the density of the lines was difficult to reproduce by hand, the gouache pattern serves a dual purpose. It secures the document against forgery, while simultaneously lulling the viewer with its dizzying, infinite symmetry, a visual representation of a closed, perfect system. Fact 85. At the bottom of the document, often near the signature line, lies the embossed seal, a tactile stamp of validation. In the past, this was a wafer of red wax. In modern times, it is a raised impression in gold foil or the paper itself. Visualize the mechanical press coming down with significant force, crushing the fibers of the paper to create a three-dimensional relief. If you were to run your thumb over the seal, you would feel the ridges of the company crest rising from the flat plane of the page. It is a topographical feature on the landscape of the contract, a physical deformation of the material that signifies the weight of the corporate obligation. Fact 86. The ink used to print the variable data, the name, the date, the premium amount, has its own specific viscosity and sheen. In the era of the typewriter, this was a ribbon ink, slightly oily, which would press into the paper, leaving a microscopic indentation. Visualize the strike of the typewriter key, the E or the A, hitting the page with a sharp clack, depositing a layer of black carbon that absorbed into the cotton fibers. In later years, the laser toner sat on top of the paper, a fused plastic dust that felt smooth and slightly raised. The stark contrast of the black characters against the creamy white background creates a binary clarity, leaving no room for ambiguity or gray areas. Fact 87. The human element enters the document through the signature of the underwriter or the company's secretary. Traditionally, this was executed in wet ink, usually a blue, that stood out against the black text to prove it was an original. Visualize the nib of a fountain pen gliding across the bottom of the page, the liquid ink pooling slightly at the turns of the letters before drying. The signature is often looped and illegible, a personal flourish that contrasts with the rigid, mechanical type above it. It represents the specific moment in time when a human hand touched the paper, binding the abstract entity of the corporation to the individual destiny of the policyholder. Fact 88. Enclosing the policy is the policy jacket or folio, often made of a heavier cardstock in a somber color like navy blue, forest green, or maroon. This protective cover serves as the binding for the multiple pages of terms and conditions. Visualize the texture of the folder, perhaps a faux leather grain or a linen finish, cool and smooth. It is folded precisely to encase the documents, often secured with a brass grommet or a staple. The jacket creates a physical package, transforming a stack of loose papers into a singular bound object, a book of rules that can be filed away, protecting the delicate interior from the wear and tear of the filing cabinet. Fact 89. Even the envelope that delivers the policy is engineered for privacy, utilizing a security tint on the interior. This is a printed pattern, usually a dense crosshatch or a chaotic scramble of letters in blue or gray, lining the inside of the envelope. Visualize peering inside the empty envelope. The pattern is dizzying and abstract, designed to scramble light and prevent anyone from reading the contents through the paper. It is a lining of visual noise, a barrier of confusion that wraps around the clarity of the contract. This hidden interior layer ensures that the sensitive data remains a secret until the seal is broken, a final wrapper of confidentiality. Fact 90. Finally, we consider the aesthetic of the fine print itself, the dense blocks of text that define the exclusions and conditions. This text is often justified, meaning the lines are even on both the left and right sides, creating solid, rectangular walls of words. Visualize the sheer density of the paragraph, the spacing between the lines, leading reduced to a minimum to fit more information. To the tired eye, the text blurs into a gray texture, a uniform field of language. It is not designed to be read quickly, but to be consulted slowly, a monolithic block of legal architecture that stands firm and immovable, defining the boundaries of the risk with exhaustively precise, microscopic detail. Fact 91. As we near the end of our survey, we consider the philosophical parallel between insurance and the biological necessity of sleep itself. Just as the insurance company sets aside a reserve of capital to withstand the shocks of the market, the human body utilizes sleep to build a reservoir of cognitive and physical energy. Visualize the brain during deep sleep, not as a machine turning off, but as a maintenance crew working quietly in a closed building. The glymphatic system opens up, washing away the metabolic waste of the day, a slow hydraulic cleansing that restores the neural pathways. It is a biological form of indemnity, a nightly process that seeks to return the organism to the state it was in before the wear and tear of the waking hours, ensuring that the system can open for business again when the sun rises. Fact 92. The fundamental promise of insurance is the removal of worry, a state of mind that is the prerequisite for slumber. The night watchman theory of the state suggests that the government exists to protect property. Similarly, the insurance policy acts as a silent sentry that stands guard while the policyholder is unconscious. Visualize the city at 3:08 a.m., the streets empty, traffic lights changing colors for no one. In the dark office towers, the servers of the insurance companies continue to hum, holding the data that protects the buildings, the cars, and the lives within the sleeping city, because the risk has been transferred to this silent electronic guardian. The individual is released from the duty of vigilance, allowed to lower their defenses and drift into the vulnerable, soft heaviness of rest. Fact 93. There is a profound stillness to be found in the concept of the zero balance, the ultimate goal of the accountant's ledger. The entire history of finance is a struggle to equate assets with liabilities, to balance the equation until there is no remainder. Visualize the moment when the final entry is made and the columns align perfectly. The tension of the math evaporates. There is nothing left to carry over, nothing left to solve. This state of financial equilibrium is analogous to the quieting of the mind required for sleep. We seek to close the mental books on the day, to reconcile the conversations and the anxieties until the internal ledger is balanced to zero, creating a blank white page on which the silence of the night can be written. Fact 94. The act of being covered is a word that shares a dual meaning in our language, applying both to the financial contract and the bed. We seek coverage against the cold wind of risk, just as we seek coverage against the cool air of the bedroom. Visualize the sensation of pulling a heavy, weighted blanket up to the chin. The weight is uniform and pressing, grounding the body to the mattress. The insurance policy is an abstract version of this blanket, a layer of protection woven from law and mathematics rather than wool and cotton. Both serve to insulate the human being from the harsh unpredictability of the exterior environment, creating a microclimate of warmth, safety, and enclosed security where the heart rate can slow and the breathing can deepen. Fact 95. In the deepest archives of the oldest insurance societies, there are ledgers that have not been opened for 100 years. These books rest in the absolute darkness of underground vaults, covered in a fine, undisturbed layer of gray dust. The ink on the pages has dried completely, becoming one with the paper. Visualize the silence of this space, where time has effectively stopped. The names in the books are no longer active participants in the economy. They are static, peaceful records. This is the deep time of the industry, a state of suspended animation, where the urgency of the claim and the panic of the loss have long since faded into history. It is a reminder that all turbulence eventually settles into dust, into paper, and into silence. Fact 96. The concept of indemnity comes from the Latin indemnis, meaning unhurt or free from loss. The goal is to make the insured whole again, to erase the event as if it never happened. In this sense, insurance is a machine for reversing time, for undoing the damage of the world. Sleep offers a similar promise of restoration. We lie down with the fatigue and the small injuries of the day, trusting that the dark hours will perform their slow, mending work. Visualize the cells repairing themselves, the muscles relaxing, the mind knitting together the frayed edges of thought. It is a nightly contract we sign with our own biology, a few hours of darkness in exchange for a restoration of the self, a return to the unhurt state of the morning. Fact 97. As the night deepens, the specific details of the risks we have discussed, the fire, the ship, the storm, begin to lose their definition, merging into a general, abstract sense of protection. The all risks policy is the ultimate abstraction, a blanket term that covers everything not specifically excluded. Visualize a vast gray umbrella opening slowly over the entire horizon, shielding the landscape from the rain. The sound of the rain on the fabric is a steady, white noise, a constant drumming that drowns out the specific fears of the individual. Underneath this canopy, the light is dim and the air is still. The details of what is covered matter less than the feeling of the cover itself, a diffuse, pervasive sense of safety that allows the mind to let go of the specific and float in the general. Fact 98. The actuary's work is ultimately an acceptance of uncertainty, a humble admission that we cannot know the future, only the probability of it. There is a peace in this acceptance. We do not need to know what tomorrow brings. We only need to know that it has been calculated and accounted for. Visualize the statistical curve, the bell curve, sloping gently down at the edges. It is a smooth, hill-like shape, predictable and symmetrical. To slide down the side of this curve is to move from the high activity of the day into the low probability of the night. The numbers soften, the calculations cease, and the sharp lines of the graph blur into the soft focus of a dream, where logic is no longer required and the math dissolves into mist. 2. Fact 99. We return finally to the image of the seal, the wax impression that closes the document. The contract is finished, the terms have been defined, the premiums paid, the risks transferred. There is nothing left to negotiate. Visualize the heavy red wax cooling and hardening, sealing the envelope shut. The contents are now private, hidden, and secure. The mind, too, places its seal upon the day. The eyes close, shutting out the light, sealing the consciousness within the sanctuary of the body. The external world, with its ledgers and its liabilities, continues to exist, but it is now on the other side of the wall, outside the seal, irrelevant to the sleeper who floats in the dark, protected, insured, and at rest. Fact 100. And so the ledger closes. The pen is laid down on the desk. The ink dries. The clerk turns off the lamp, and the room fills with shadows. The only sound remaining is the steady, rhythmic ticking of the master clock on the wall, marking the seconds. Then the minutes. Perfectly even, perfectly slow. The tick, the tock, the tick, the tock. It is the heartbeat of the building. The heartbeat of the system, the heartbeat of the sleeper. The risk is gone, the stability remains, the debt is paid, the balance is zero, the night is long, the silence is here. Drift, fade, sleep.
From these early documents, we trace the origins of insurance, a concept born from the human desire for security and a peaceful night's sleep.